Okay, I think I'm gonna get going. If others join us, they'll be able to catch up. Welcome to today's session on handling redundancies. I'm Helen Underwood. I'm the Events and Communications Officer at Lloyds Bank Foundation, and I'm joined today by Gill Taylor, who will be leading this session, who is one of our enhanced partners, which is our capacity and development building program for charities. Firstly, just wanted to mention that we're running today's session as a webinar rather than a traditional meeting format that some of you might be more familiar with. That means you won't be able to turn your mic on or your video during this session, and we've done that to enable you to participate anonymously if you choose to. Gill, as I've just said, is one of our local consultants we partner with, who provides a range of through our enhanced program, which provides charities with a range of tailored development support in addition to their grant. Gill is a fellow of the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development and has over 30 years experience within the non-for-profit sector. She's supported many small and medium-sized charities on HR issues and has helped charities develop and deliver the redundancy process. So before I hand over to Gill, I'm just going to go through some Zoom housekeeping, and just so you know how you can participate and engage in the session this morning. This will really help in the session running smoothly, so bear with me for a moment. So we're going to use the chat function today as the means for you to communicate with Gill and I. You can find this at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So if you scroll to the bottom, you'll see a chat function, and that allows you to communicate with us. So if you have any technical issues today, feel free to pop them in the chat to myself or panelists, that's Gill and I. I'll do my best to help out. If you've got any questions as we go through the session, you can also pop them in the chat. If you're happy for everyone to see your question, you can ask it to all panelists and attendee. You'll see there's a little box in the chat box which allows you to change that. If you want to ask your question anonymously, just write it to all panelists and that will just come to Gill and I. And Gill will be taking questions throughout the session this morning. So as we're going through, feel free to pop your questions in there, and we'll do our best. Well, Gill will do her best to answer them as we move through the session. Also, just a flag that we are recording today's session so that we can share it with you and others afterwards. Just wanted to flag that your names and organisations won't show in that recording, so you are able to participate anonymously. I think that's everything for me. If anybody does have questions as we go through, remember to pop them in the chat, and I'll hand over to Gill now. Thanks, Gill.
Right. Thanks, Helen. So welcome everybody. My name's Gill Taylor, as Helen has said. I'm an independent HR expert. I've been working in the charity sector as a consultant for over 32 years, and before that I started work in the sector in 1982. So I'm a vol sector person through and through. I work mainly with small and medium charities, and I've been working with Lloyds since 2015, providing HR support through the enhanced programme. I'm going to speak for about an hour in total, and I'll take questions after each section. The webinar is in 3 parts, and we will have a comfort break after part 1, which will be in about 45 minutes. I will try and respond to major points and questions on the way through. So after each section, which I'll tell you what they are in a minute, please gather your thoughts or questions then, and I'll try and answer those. You've had the redundancy briefing, so that's a 20-page document I prepared earlier. I'm going to be going through that basically and then adding my hints and tips on the way through. So I'm aiming this at senior staff and decision makers planning redundancy processes. That might be trustees as well. And I assume you know nothing, so I'll go from basics and work up to that. Just a last little thing, I'm not a lawyer. I do know a lot about the law in this area, but I'm not a lawyer. So I'm giving you guidance, not advice. And in any case, in order to give you real in-depth guidance, I need to know more about your individual circumstances. So Helen, we're going to start with a poll on what do you know already, please. Where's Helen? There we go. If you could just vote on this. So how much experience do you have of redundancies? Expert. I've conducted it recently. Experienced, but I haven't conducted it recently. Novice, I've never done a redundancy and I've been through it but not done it myself. So if you could just vote, please, and then we'll share the results. It's just to give me a little hint about how much you might know already. Okay, right. Okay, so that's a good range of experiences there. As I say, I will treat it as if you know nothing, but I will take more in-depth questions from those who've had a little bit of experience if it's relevant for everybody. Okay, thank you. So I'm going to start now. Moving on. So these are the three parts we're going to go through. The first and longest part will be talking about planning and preparation, because that's where you should spend most of your time getting ready for the launch. Now, Dave, what I mean by it, and we'll also look at the law, because that needs to inform your planning and preparation as well. Then we're going to go on to what I call the launch of consultation, which is the day you go public to everybody. So the analogy I like to use, it's the day you get on the flume. It's the day we go public and there's no going back. So everything has to be right and ready by that point. And then part 3, we'll look at redeployment and endings and good process for that bit. So in terms of planning and preparation then, at the moment, I just looked up, CIPD have issued a new briefing this week on the state of the economy in HR. 33%, sadly, of all employers are planning on making redundancies before the end of September, and of that, 28% of voluntary organisations. I think this is the deepest and most challenging recession I've probably experienced, and it's only just starting. So we are going to be looking at many redundancies, I feel, in the voluntary sector, which is a dreadful thing to have to do when need is rising, I expect, for most of you. So what do we do then when we're planning? Well, you start looking at strategy and scenarios. What is the challenge for my organisation? How many posts might I need to lose? At this point, this planning and preparation should be kept to as few people as possible. So it might just be the chief exec and the chair. It might involve the head of finance if you have a head of finance, or somebody who can help you with the financial planning if that's not you yourself. Because we want this time period to be confidential. We don't want anything to leak out to the rest of the staff before we're ready to launch, because that will just worry them more. And we need to be ready with excellent communication and excellent materials on that launch day. So if you have got people on furlough, there are some particular things we need to know about that, and also the legal parameters for what you can do. You'll be needing to cost and shape the plan of your new restructured organisation and draw a new organisation chart, because that should be one of the key documents that goes in your proposal to staff. Look at your timescale, and I'll go on to a bit more detail about possibilities for that next. And one of the things we need to look at is, what is the end date of the current structure? What time are you planning to end not just consultation but redeployment, and then add on a bit? So we need a date. It might be something like, one of my clients who launched this week has an end date of the 21st of September, for example. And the reason we need an end date that you work to is that is the date we use in planning notice periods and redundancy pay calculations. So we do need an actual date. Then we go on to think about plans for individual posts. We don't start with individuals, we start with posts that you need, because if you start around individuals, we end up in a dreadful muddle, because it becomes too emotional and too difficult to really think it through correctly and legally. Write all the background documents and letters that should be going on in this planning and preparation. And one of the key things that's really important is it's all a proposal until after consultation has ended. So your duty to staff is to put forward to them a proposal for what you're going to do. So here's the typical timeline of the three parts. So in planning, I've allowed you a month. It might be less than that if it's relatively simple and you have a few things to do, but you do have to have quite a lot of pieces of paper ready for your launch. So we need the business case or the proposal. We need job descriptions for any redeployment posts, well worked out, because that's what the people who are at risk of redundancy are going to be judging whether to go for those posts on those job descriptions. The letters, the individual letters for individuals. Frequently asked questions on the process is always a good idea, and I do have a template, one of those that people can have afterwards. Scripts for the meetings, so the launch meeting, any staff meeting, all staff meeting you'll be having, and also individual consultation meetings. So this is a good idea to make sure that any manager doing these things ends up saying the same stuff. And again, I have templates of all of those which people on this webinar can have access to afterwards. So then a typical consultation, if you're doing individual consultation, and we'll come back to what that means in a minute, there is no statutory minimum, there is no statutory maximum. So I always recommend at least a week, probably 2, and no more than 30 days. So at that point, we'll be doing consultation. And then we move on to the end of consultation and what happens then, and then redeployment and endings. So this is a typical overall timeline that you'll be looking at to plan how you arrive at your end date, how you look at your strategy when you're planning. I'll go over this all again as we go through. This is just a snapshot of a typical consultation process and the whole redundancy process, really. So once you've done your planning, we then go on to look at what are the options for individuals. So you've got your current organogram, your current staff structure, and your new proposed staff structure now, and you start to look at what's changed from A to B. So this will tell you which jobs you'll be putting at risk of redundancy. If the job stays the same, it's not at risk. If the job has minor changes, but stays within the grade and the competency of the person doing that job, what you can suggest is it's a slot in. So that means that the person doing that job will slot into the proposed slightly changed job in the new structure. This process, this part of the process is also part of your proposal, and so part of open to consultation. Other people at risk of redundancy could challenge that and say, well, I don't understand why they're slotted in and I'm not. So if there are major changes or work has ceased or diminished, this is the definition of redundancy, or need for work of that particular type at that particular location has ceased or diminished, then the post is at risk of redundancy. And if you've got several people doing the same job or having the same job title, like say for advice workers, you've got 5 advice workers and you only need 4, then you are putting all of those jobs at risk, and you have to explain the selection process for why, for what's going to happen to get 5 down to 4. And I'll go over the best processes for that when we look at the law section. So this is when you start working out which jobs am I going to be putting at risk of redundancy. Because again, that needs to go in your proposal. So what goes in this business case then? It's a key document. It's a proposal. It's always a proposal, and it must be agreed by the board or a subset of the board, always the chair, possibly a working group of the board. What we need is the rationale for change. So what is your new vision or strategy or way of working or different delivery methods? What are the other drivers? COVID-19, the economic situation, funding, need, etc. Maybe you're moving to doing a lot more work online than you have done in the past. So that can be a kind of a driver or a part of the strategy or way of working. You need to put in alternatives you've considered to minimise redundancies. And this, if you have staff on furlough, should mention, we have looked at furlough, but we cannot sustain furlough till the end of October. We need to be putting staff at risk now. So then we go on to how this will affect the organisation overall, how many posts are at risk, then the detailed list of the posts at risk, and a proposed new organisation structure, how we've selected posts, if it's some from among many, posts proposed slotted in and posts not affected at this time, any redeployment posts, and if you think they're suitable alternative or just alternative employment, I'll go over what that means in the law section. What will happen next? So the consultation process plus dates. Who will be involved in assessing counter proposals? Because what the point of consultation is for staff who are at risk, is to be able to put forward an alternative. And so that would come as what you can call a counter proposal or an alternative suggestion. And that needs to be by the last day of the consultation period. So all of those need to be in writing. They could be comments, they could be other organisational plans, they could be all kinds of things that staff want to suggest for a different way forward. So then you have to assess those. So somebody like the chief exec or a chief exec and the trustee needs to assess them. It shouldn't just be the chief exec, it should be somebody I recommend on the board as well. Then we need to look at what is our redeployment process. Have we got any alternative jobs available? How are we going to let people who are at risk apply for those jobs and see what happens? Plus any proposed dates, which may be subject to change, but this is, you know, this shows that you've thought out your process within the timescale you're offering. And of course, any support available for staff. So that's your technical part of getting ready. Someone's just put up, for those staff not at risk, are they part of the consultation? Technically, no, they're not, because consultation is part of a legal process of ending someone's contract. So the staff who are at risk have to be consulted. For those who aren't at risk, I usually advise saying you can put forward suggestions because that helps them feel involved and they may have views about what's going on. But strictly speaking, you don't have to take those into account with as much weight as any suggestions from those at risk. But it is good to involve everybody in the process. Now, this is the key thing, really. Redundancy is always awful. My partner was made redundant from a job when we had a new baby 6 months old. I will never forget that moment because I was already a freelance. So we'd gone from being one worker and one freelance to someone with no work and a freelance and a 6-month-old baby. Yes, we did get through it, but that was a lulu of a situation. And the emotions will be very high. I don't know if anyone's ever experienced redundancy, but it is a very difficult moment. So we need to plan for this. We need to plan and prepare and manage it as best we can for everybody, for ourselves and for those who are at risk of redundancy. So obviously there will be some predictable ones: upset, anger, anxiety, grief, until they can see a way through for themselves. And so that's what our real task is to help staff we've just put at risk of redundancy see a way through this process. Now, the way to anchor staff is to give them confidence that you know what you're doing. So how we do that is we make sure we have excellent preparation. That's why you're going to be spending most of your time in preparation and writing those documents as clearly as possible, that it's got to be in line with the law and it's got to be in line with people's rights. Show concern, obviously, I don't need to tell you that, you're all in the voluntary sector. We show concern every day of our working lives. We're clear and stick to scripts. Clarity is what they want, and communicate more than you think you need to. You know, a redundancy is a complex situation to get a grip on. You will need to get your head around all of this process and the law and planning, and then they need to be clear about what you're saying. Tell them where they can get support. If you can offer anything internally, if you can't offer anything internally, then they can always call ACAS. They can look on ACAS website. In fact, ACAS should be your friend. ACAS website has fantastic free documentation, processes, etc., etc. You can look at those. The staff can also look at them and ring up. Well, you can ring up as well. So I'll go over the launch day in part 2, because the launch day is when you're going to be going public with all of this and when all of these emotions are coming out. And I do have a very tried and tested way to manage that day, which does work to minimise the best of this situation, but you can minimise the upset for everybody. And I do have scripts for these key meetings, as I've said. Other support might be from your EAP scheme, your employee assistance program, if you have one, or I don't know what else you might be able to put in place. So the secrets of success then for this beginning bit. Plan your proposal really well before the launch, know the law and manage your risk areas, manage the expectations of staff and managers. If more than you are doing the consultations, then train those senior staff and make sure they all know what to say. Consistency of message. If someone asks you something in an individual consultation meeting and you don't know the answer, just say, I don't know the answer to that. I'm going to have to get some advice on that. Don't make it up on the hoof as you go. And then when, when somebody asks something in one consultation meeting that you think is going to be relevant for everybody else, update those FAQs so that you've got a list of things. You don't have to keep saying it over and over again. Write every query or conversation down, particularly during the individual consultation meetings, but also have, what I recommend is that you get yourself a little notebook, whoever's the key lead on this, and when somebody talks to you informally, just write it down that they've talked to you. They've asked you this question, what are you going to do? Because one of the ways in which we minimise the risk of complaint of unfair dismissal for redundancy is to have evidence that the person did ask this question, we did answer it. So that it's really useful to have a special little notebook that you write stuff down in. Allow plenty of time to talk to staff in as many ways as possible. When you've launched, your job is to manage this consultation process, so don't plan anything else big in your life at that moment. And if doing this remotely, be proactive and checking in with staff. Again, the launch of my client who's launched this week has done 11 people remotely and then a staff meeting on Zoom. So this is going to add an extra spin on the difficulties of communication, but be prepared, be clear, make sure they've got the documents remotely by email. Expect high emotions, it's inevitable, and keep yourself grounded so that you, in order to deal with them, work out where your support is coming from if you're the chief exec or the senior staff person managing all of this. So that's the end of my first bit on planning. Any questions on the planning process or this first bit of preparation? I'll take those now for 5 minutes if anyone's got any.
Jill, you've probably seen we've got no questions that have come through at the moment.
Very quiet.
But let's give everyone a few minutes, and if anything's come up, then please do pop that in the chat, and Jill will go through those questions.
If not, I'm going to blind you with the law next. So I hope everyone's paying attention, and there will be a quiz at the end of it. So, oh dear. Oh, that's nice. Thank you. Someone said I've explained it all very clearly. Excellent. Well, it's also in the briefing that I've sent round, and could we have the presentation emailed? I think you're going to get that. Yes. Helen, you're going to email the presentation, aren't you?
Yeah, I can do that. Yeah.
Well, okay. Well, let's welly on then with the law next. So this is the most heavy duty bit, which you need to get a grip on. So, legal parameters. There's a lot of law about redundancy, and just to give you a little bit of context, the law originated in the 1970s for industry, and a lot of it still is the same. So a lot of it doesn't feel very relevant for us, but we still have to follow it. So I'll tell you what the law is, and then I'll tell you the best way through it for us in small and medium organisations, because sadly I've had a lot of experience of doing these processes over the years, and I know where all the bodies are buried to help you through this, to make sure you get as few challenges as possible, because the last thing we want is legal challenges after this incredibly difficult process. So all endings of contracts are called a dismissal in law, and redundancy is a type of dismissal. So one of the 5 fair reasons for dismissal. All dismissals have to be fair. So how do we make our redundancy a fair process? So we remember that the definition of redundancy is work has ceased or diminished, or work of that type in that particular location has ceased or diminished. So if you're cut, that's a redundancy. It's not a redundancy if you cut the job 1 week and re-advertise the same job in 2 weeks' time. That is not a redundancy, okay? So in order to be fair, you need to show that you've considered alternatives. And at the moment, that includes furlough and voluntary redundancy, I would say. And this is one of your duties, that you have to show you've done this as part of consultation. You must carry out consultation, either collective or individual, and I'll talk about that in a minute. You must have a proposal or business case for the staff at risk. You must show how you've selected those posts at risk. And again, I'm going to go through the detail of all of this in this section. You must offer any redeployment options. So any job that you have vacant at that moment that you launch has to be offered up as a redeployment option. Even if you think none of those you're going to put at risk is going to apply for it, doesn't matter. If it's existing as a vacancy, a live vacancy, it's got to be part of redeployment. You give staff their redundancy rights. And also, just in case you've got anything better than statutory, what I'm going to be talking about here is the statutory minimum. You check your own contract and your own redundancy policy for what might be additional rights to enhanced redundancy, or I don't know what it might say, but particularly enhanced redundancy. As I've said, let ACAS be your friend, as well as anything else you can get your hand on that's good advice. So we need to show how we've avoided redundancies. Freeze vacant posts and offer as redeployment. Reduce the number of temporary staff, reducing the hours of work, possibly. Now, that has to be a consultation with the workforce because it's a variation of contract. People might prefer that to redundancy. It might come up as one of the alternatives in your consultation. So you just need to think about whether you might consider that, whether it would be feasible. You don't have to answer definitely on the way through consultation, but you can say, we'll look at it, but we think it might be difficult, or whatever you want to say. Asking for salary reductions. Now, again, that would be a contract variation that you must consult on. Voluntary redundancy is a good one to offer. Now, voluntary redundancy in the voluntary sector, and voluntary redundancy not in our sector, would often attract an additional payment. So let's say anybody who wants to go for voluntary redundancy could get an extra £1,000 on top of any redundancy they might entitled to. Often we can't offer an additional payment because we're up against the wall on the finances anyway. But what we can say is it's a short circuit to the process. If you know you're ready to go, you go now, you can go now, we'll let you go soon. And that means that the people who are still at risk know that there's one less person applying for those jobs. You mustn't force people into it, obviously, but it can be an attractive option for some people, depending on where they are in their careers. The important thing about voluntary redundancy is you can refuse applications. So we don't want our key staff asking for voluntary redundancy. So next thing, consultation. This is about numbers. So it's important to understand how you count up the posts that you're putting at risk. So if you're putting more than 19 posts in a 90-day period at one establishment at risk, that's collective consultation. You have to do collective consultation, which has a 30-day statutory period, and you must consult with union reps or elected employee representatives. I hope you're not as big enough, any of you, but if you are, then I can go through that probably after today. If it's fewer staff than that, then we have to do individual consultation. And if you're doing collective consultation anyway, you still have to do individual consultation. Everybody gets individual consultation. Now, there is no statutory time limit on individual consultation. It can be as little as 1 week. It can be, I wouldn't go more than 30 days ever, because that's a long time to have a consultation process going on and all the uncertainty that that entails. It can run at the same time as collective. I've said that. I recommend 2 to 3 weeks, because that's long enough for people to get a grip on what's going on and short enough to minimise uncertainty. You can't issue notice until after the end of consultation. What the 90-day period means. So let's say you put 5 staff at risk on the 1st of January, and 90 days is 3 months, isn't it? So let's say you put, how many? 5 in January and 20, and I don't know, 15 in March, beginning of March. That adds up to 19 to 20 posts in that 90-day period. So the 90-day period is a length of physical time. If you've already been through redundancies once, let's say in June, you need to watch your 90-day time limit. Is that right? June, July, August, yeah. And also, the other thing is, did I mean to do that? Not quite yet. What was the other thing I was going to say? Oh, establishment. So establishment is a concept that came from case law to do with Woolworths, when we had Woolworths. So the question was, if I'm making staff redundant at Leicester Woolworths, do I have to put all staff in all of Woolworths across the whole country at risk of redundancy? And the answer came back, no, just the ones in Leicester, because Leicester Woolworths is an establishment. So for us, if we've got staff in different locations, quite honestly, they're not likely to be an establishment. They're likely to be employed by you in your establishment, wherever your headquarters is. And, you know, we have to take everybody into consideration. So if you've got regional staff all doing the same job or having the same job title, you want to make the one in the Northwest region redundant, but you've got 5 of them around the country. I'm really sorry, but you have to put all of them at risk and say we're going to have whichever jobs are left in whichever regions. They all have the right to go for those jobs, wherever they're located. Okay, next then. So back to our consultation period. So this is a sample 3-week individual consultation period. Did I say that you can't issue notice until after the end of consultation, by the way? So that's here, that's when we give notice here. We don't give it here, we give it here. Okay, and that's an important part of making consultation fair, is that we don't issue notice at the start of consultation, because that looks like you've made up your mind. You can't have made up your mind. It's got to be a genuine consultation where we listen to what staff have got to say back to us. So we launch on day 1, let's say September the 1st. We have a 3-week consultation period, individual consultation. We have a 2-week period to apply for the voluntary redundancy, and only for those at risk. We're not opening this up to anybody, I would suggest, because why would you? You know, you're looking to treat those people at risk more beneficially than those who aren't. And during this time, we have individual consultation meetings for those at risk. And I'll go over that later when we're looking at launch, after our break. So we then have the end of consultation, which brings us to you consider what the alternatives are in this 2-day period. The Chief Exec and the Trustees sit down together and look at that. And then we go into redeployment. Now you write the second letter. So you have the second letter going out to people, which is confirmation of redundancy. You give notice to everybody. That's always the best. Give notice to everybody, because you will rescind it for people who get the jobs. Once people have got jobs, you then rescind the notice you've given to them. So you confirm what everything is going to be. You're settled on your organogram. You've still got the same redeployment opportunities, or you haven't. Then you do expressions of interest, internal redeployment, redeployment's confirmed, and then for those not, we're looking at how we let them go. They'll go over all this in part 3. Now, alternative employment and suitable alternative employment. I'm noticing that question. I'll cover that in the next slide. Here we go. So, here we go. Oh, I know what I was going to say. Sorry. When we're counting up the jobs at risk, let me just go back to that, because this is a really important thing. When you're looking at how do we count up 19? This is the number of jobs you put at risk. So it includes fixed term contracts, it includes voluntary redundancies. It is not the number of jobs you expect to make redundant at the end of it. It is the total number of jobs you put at risk at the start. That's an important point, because that's maybe a bigger number than the number of jobs you expect to lose. But as long as it's under 19 or under, you only have to do individual consultation. So now then, selection and redeployment options. So this is a little bit complicated. Let's start by saying, how do we select those at risk? Now this is where we get into a little bit of complication with the fact that the law is very old. The law is old and it was written for industry. So it assumes that you're going to be making, let's say you've got a bus garage and you've got 30 bus drivers and you're going to be making 10 of those bus drivers redundant. So in the olden days, or perhaps in industry still, or perhaps in the private sector, the method commonly used is called a selection matrix, whereby you take a list of criteria, and the list of criteria are commonly things like attendance, sickness absence, performance measures, any disciplinaries the person's been through. Now, these are alien to us. We don't tend to monitor that rigorously. I hate the idea of selecting people for redundancy on criteria like that. If you use a matrix, you have to tell the staff what it is. And you have to show where the bar is. You know, how many points do I have to get over the bar? And not a good idea. You're going to get lots and lots of queries and challenges on that. And no wonder. It's a horrible way to decide who to put at risk of redundancy. So my favourite is, if you've got a job that's a unique job, let's say it's a finance coordinator and you decide you no longer need a finance coordinator, you've only got one, then that is the way you've selected it. It's a pool of one. If you have 5 advice workers and you only need 4, you are putting a pool, you have a pool of 5 of those advice workers. How we're going to decide, my best advice, is to put all 5 at risk of redundancy and then give the whole 5 the chance to go for the 4 redeployment jobs. So your selection process is an interview, a redeployment interview. This has been shown to be fair. It's what we know how to do as well. And it also gives people choices and options, which is the best way during redundancies, is to give people choices, not to close choices off. Which brings me to my second point. So one of the things you can do is allocate jobs that are available in the new organogram to jobs in the old anagram and say, well, that's suitable alternative employment for you. So what that means is you judge it by criteria like job content, status, which is a funny thing, but what they really mean is pay grade, pay, status, job content. So let's say we're making 6 staff redundant, 2 managers, 2 officers and 2 admin. And in the new envisioned future, we've got 1 manager job, 1 officer job and 1 admin job. So you could say the managers can apply for the manager jobs, but you can always apply downwards. You must always let people apply downwards, because that has been judged to be unfair, because it might be the case that your manager is really terrified of trying to get a job on the open market and would rather have an officer job with you. So you can't deny downward applications. You can, however, deny upward applications. So you can say the officers can't apply upwards, the admin can't apply upwards, because they're not suitable alternative employment. They're only alternative employment. However, that is a way you can do it, but it's not a way I recommend, because I think closing off options for people is always a bad idea. If you say to people, as part of our redeployment process, we're going to allow applications, anybody can apply for any redeployment job, provided they think they meet the person spec for that job. And then you let people choose. Really good idea. In my experience, it is rare for people to be unrealistic at this point. They know they can't go for a manager job if you're specifying 2 years of managerial experience in your person spec or whatever you would normally put in your manager job description. It's a good, safe way to do redeployment. However, you can specify that some jobs are suitable alternative employment. Then we get onto the tricky little thing that comes later, which is if somebody turns down a suitable alternative employment job that you consider it suitable alternative, then they're supposed to not get a redundancy, because redundancy payment is to compensate you for not having a job. And if you've got a job, we've offered you a job, it's suitable alternative, but you don't want it, then you're not supposed to get your redundancy payment. Now, I don't like that idea either, because then you're trying to keep someone who doesn't really want to work for you. My best advice would be to let them go, but you could follow that rule, but I don't advise it. Now, the other little wrinkle in all of this is that anyone you've got on maternity, shared parental adoption leave, at the time you launched your consultation and you're putting their jobs at risk, they go first for redeployment options, absolutely without question. Absolutely without question. They have to get a job, if possible, among your redeployment options. If there is a suitable job that they can do, they go first. It's one of the few ways, perhaps the only way in which women on maternity leave or anybody on adoption or parental leave has an advantage over anybody else. But it is true, it is the law. So I can go over this. This is one of the most complicated bits in the whole decision-making process about what to do at this point. So I'll come back to questions on this later. I'll just carry on with the law, if that's okay with people. 2 more slides and then we're doing a roundup. Okay, so statutory redundancy rights. For anybody at risk with any length of service, they have to be considered for redeployment into suitable alternative work, and that includes people on fixed-term contracts. To notice, now the notice is to contractual notice or statutory notice, whichever is greater. So contractual notice is what you get in your contract. Here's my contract, and it says I have 1 month notice. But I've been with you for 6 years at the end date. I've got 6 years completed length of service. That means statutory notice is 6 weeks, okay? Because statutory notice starts at 1 week at 1 month, 2 weeks at 2 years, 3 weeks at 3 years, 4 weeks at 4 years, 5 weeks at 5 years, and so on, up to 12 years length of service. So statutory notice, if you've got 12 years length of service, is 12 weeks. And you must give people you're making redundant the notice, whichever is greater, either contractual or statutory. Reasonable time off to seek other work. And if 2 years length of service at the end date or more, then they get a statutory redundancy payment. And there's plenty of ways of working out what that is. The government has an online calculator for that. You need their start date, end date, and age to work it all out, but it does it for you. So that's handy. Statutory redundancy maximum at the moment is £538 a week. If they paid more than that and you're doing statutory, they get statutory. If they're paid less than that, it is the actual amount they're paid per week. Okie dokie. Next one then, a little bit on furlough. So if you've got anyone on furlough, people on furlough can be put at risk before the end of October. Your business case should show why you can't delay redundancy, just because furlough is meant to prevent redundancies, really. So why can't you delay it? And that will be because of pressing reasons to do with finances, cash flow, etc. Don't select those on furlough just because they're on furlough. That's the key thing. You can't just pick everyone who's on furlough and leave aside everyone who's not on furlough. Work out good remote communication. And the law changed. We have new law on the 1st of August saying that statutory redundancy pay is normal pay. Notice pay is based on normal pay. Holidays not taken at the end date are normal pay. You can claim all of that back through furlough. You can't claim back pay in lieu of notice through furlough or redundancy payments. Okie dokie. So roundup for this whole part 1 then is that planning is the key time. It is post, not person. It's a proposal until after consultation has ended, and you must talk about it as if it's a proposal, not a done deal. Key consistent messaging is vital. Consistent, accurate paperwork, and write down all those conversations, formal and informal. Okie dokie, we're going to do a quiz in a minute. Not yet, Helen, but I'll just take some questions now. Where are we?
So you've got one from Claire, which, well, sorry, I shouldn't be saying names. What happens if the at-risk staff changes following consultation? Do you have to start consultation again?
Well, this is where the planning and preparation becomes really important. So I would hope that when you start consultation, you know who's at risk, ideally, because, you know, we need consistency of process. If you're doing a 2-week consultation period, ideally it shouldn't change during that period. Another key tip is that if you are expecting more changes and you think you're going to have to go harder, the awful truth is to go harder to start with, because what staff hate most is more change. So it is better, and my long experience tells me it is better to manage one period of change that may be slightly more brutal than you need it to be. I know this is a really hard thing to say, than to have uncertainty during the consultation period. So that might be you might have quite a complicated question to ask about that, and you can ask me later on email. But timing is of the key thing. Your timing is part of that massive preparation you have to do, is look at when is the best time to launch, when is the most secure time for me to launch my process.
Thanks, Jill. We had another question around, which I think you covered, around do you have to offer alternative employment as opposed to suitable alternative employment to people at risk being made redundant?
Yeah, I think my preferred process is to offer, give staff the opportunity to apply for everything and base it on, do they meet the person spec? That is your kindest way, your safest way to avoid complaints or challenges. And also, staff are pretty good at recognising what they can go for, in my experience.
We've got a few more coming through.
Yep,
so we've got what is the best way to communicate to the organisation that you're planning redundancies? Should you speak to the at-risk staff first and then issue a company statement to all staff in a situation where not all staff are being made redundant?
Yes, and this is exactly what I'm going to go through, the dance of the day, the red letter day, the launch day, after we've had our quiz and our break. I'm going to go through exactly, in words of one syllable, what I found to be the best process. But that is it in a nutshell. Yeah.
Great. And then just one more specific on furlough. So with someone on furlough, if there will not be a job for them in October, are you supposed to just delay the redundancy until the end of furlough? It would significantly add costs in the meantime.
No, if you can't afford it, again, organisations that I'm working with now who have staff on furlough are saying we just cannot afford to keep them on furlough. You know, our cash flow we'd go under if we did that. So you don't have to. You just have to put that reasoning in your business case and show why you can't keep them on furlough till the end of October. Okay, so I'm going to have a little look at that question that came in, and then we're going to carry on to parts 2 and 3. We're aiming to finish at 12, yeah? So we've got half an hour. So I'm the chair of a charity that serves ethnic and minority women and girls. Majority of our service users speak a particular language, often cannot speak English. Of all the staff, 2 of them did not speak the language spoken by the majority, hence these 2 were chosen to be made redundant as a decision of the board. Right, okay, so, well, I think that what I would have done is follow the process I've outlined and look at which staff we could put at risk of redundancy. If you had a group of staff, let's say 5 advice workers or 5 community workers, some of whom could speak the language and some couldn't, I would have put all 5 at risk with the 3 redeployment jobs and then let them apply for it. Now, the question then would, because that's fairer, that allows more choice for the individuals. The risk of selecting those 2 to be put at risk without going through that process is they could claim unfair selection for redundancy. They could also possibly claim automatically unfair dismissal because, although language is not necessarily associated with ethnicity, it often is. And so they could say, well, we're not of that particular ethnic group, therefore we were discriminated against. You'd have to look at the very particular circumstances in the situation, but it is more risky to, it's less risky to put a group of people at risk, 5 of them at risk, and let them apply for the jobs. You still might be challenged on the fact that you've put in your person spec must be able to speak a community language, but presumably if you can show that that is essential for being able to do the work effectively, then you can have it in there without it necessarily being a automatic qualification under the Race Relations Act. That's a complicated question for me to give an answer in an open forum though, so you would have needed legal advice on the particular circumstances. Okie dokie. Any more questions on the law? Are we all done on that? In which case then, let us welly on to our red letter day, launch of consultation. So we are on the flume. We're ready. We've got all of our documents ready. We have the right, correct paperwork and process. This is the day we go public with it, which is why I quite like the idea of a flume, because we're up there, we're at the top, we've reached the top, we've got our cosy on, we're pretty exposed, and you will feel pretty exposed on this day. One of my top tips is don't do it on a Friday, a Thursday, any other day but Friday, because you launch on the Friday, people will have lots and lots of questions for you that they may not think about till they've been home and talked to their partners or their whoever they need to talk to. And so the following day, they will have lots of questions, whether they've got an individual consultation meeting or not on the following day. Just be prepared for lots of questions. And it is not a good idea to let them mull over the weekend. So you will be getting ready. You will have the right and correct paperwork. You'll be ready for the communication plan and the emotions. And then we'll look at what happens in these other situations as part of this bit, about 10 minutes worth of this bit. So the shape of the day. Now this is based on my long experience of doing these things, and I have done them different ways over the years, but this is the best. So the shape of the day is we have individual, what I call a heads up meeting. So this is with those individuals. Each individual gets 10 minutes on that day, which is you ask them to keep it confidential, saying, really sorry, your post is at risk. You know the staff meeting later, you don't have to come to it, you can go home. Here's your pack of information. You actually hand them their pack of information if you're doing it face to face, or you email it to them after the meeting, after your 10 minutes. Again, recently, this week, I've had a client go through this. She planned 10 minutes. It was 5 minutes on average for each person. And it was all remote, all done by Zoom. You ask them to keep it confidential. You don't want them on the blower to everybody else, because once they've opened their pack, they will see who else is at risk of redundancy. You tell them, or during this 10-minute briefing, you say, please keep it confidential. Have the courtesy to let me give the same message to everybody, because that's what everybody deserves, is the same message at this time. Please be sensitive to everybody else who's getting this. They can come to the staff meeting later if they like, but they don't have to. So the staff meeting then, okay, what goes in the pack? So the pack of information you have ready is the business case, their individual letter outlining their rights and options, the job descriptions for any redeployment jobs, and FAQs on the whole process, and where to get help if they need other help, phone ACAS. I have scripts for all of these 3 events. I have a script for the heads up meeting, I have a script for the staff meeting, and I have a script for the individual consultation meeting, which you can all have afterwards if you email me. The staff meeting, let's say we're doing this after lunch, 2 o'clock-ish. You invite everybody. If you're doing it on a Monday, you've invited them on the Friday. Everybody knows it's going to be a red letter day by now. You just have to fend off queries about why we're all having a staff meeting, etc. Half an hour to an hour would be my anticipated time for that, and let people ask questions. because that's what they want. They want to know what's going on. They want to know what's happening to their friends, etc. Okay, so that's how to plan the day. It's going to be a big day for you. Look after yourself as well. It's going to be a big day for everybody. People will be upset and angry. Of course they will. They might be shocked. They might be resigned, but this is what they want to know in order of importance. What's the impact on their own job, their future, their finances? What's the impact on their colleagues? Are they being treated fairly or legally and legally? Are they being supported? And then the future of the organisation in general. So this is why we do the heads up meetings, so that they have the time and the courtesy in advance of everybody else who's not at risk to read through the proposal, to get their heads around what's happening for them. The way to anchor staff is to deliver a good, strong, consistent narrative. So the more you look like you know exactly what's going on. I don't mean to sound rude. I just mean to say that you need to be confident on the launch day in what you're saying. You need to have gone over this over and over again. You need to have it off by heart so that you know you're delivering the best narrative you can for everybody. You're doing genuine consultation. So we're not issuing notice till the end of consultation. They genuinely have the right to put forward an alternative. Now, a common comment obviously is that, well, you've sewn it all up, you know what you're doing, you've thought of all this. And you go, no, it is genuine. We really want to know. We have thought about it, and this is the best thing we've come up with. That's why it's a proposal. You may have other ideas. Set out the process, be clear about their rights, show you're listening, communicate more than you think you need to, and support each other as senior managers. So let's just remember about the different consultation types. Collective consultation, talk to me later if you need to about that. Individual consultation, no statutory time limit, recommend 2 weeks. There actually, in law, is no right to be accompanied to these, but I recommend you do, and check what it says in your own policy. Always keep good notes and send to the person for signing afterwards. If you if you remember your notebook, keep your notebook by your hand. If you have informal chats, write them down in the notebook. So during that consultation period, communicate more than you think you have to, over and over again, say it over and over again. If they ask questions you don't know the answer to, get an answer from ACAS or someone like me or a lawyer, and then answer it and add to the FAQs if you think it's necessary. If they get a new job during the consultation period, they're resigning to take up a new job, so then they're putting themselves out of the redundancy process. So what happens at the end of consultation? End of consultation day. So let's say you've done a 2-week consultation period. The end day of consultation is 14th of September. I've no idea if that's a weekday or not, 4 p.m. They must send in written proposals by 4 o'clock on the end date, and preferably electronically. Technically, only those at risk can do that, but you can, of course, consider from other staff. Work out who is going to assess the counter proposals and give a couple of days for this to happen. Then you announce your final plans with confirmation of redundancy letters and give notice. So giving notice. So this is your second big letter. This is the end of consultation letter. Confirmation of redundancy. Confirm the structure or explain alterations. Give notice to staff. Explain the redeployment process. Explain who to contact with more questions. Go over their redundancy pay again and other payments like holidays accrued but not have time to take, pay in lieu of notice if you're doing that, and give them time off to look for other work. So we'll go over more of that in the endings bit, which is part 3. So I see I have a long question here. Let's have a look at this. Organisation open from last week in January to second week in December. Okay, employ staff on fixed term contracts. Started this year in February, yeah, in the process of reopening. Okay, well, fixed term contract. If you are ending their contract because work has ceased or diminished, technically it is a redundancy. Now, obviously, if they have under 2 years length of service, they're not going to attract redundancy payments, but they will attract the right to redeployment posts. So that's what you do with fixed term contract employees. Yes, I do have a list of what should be included in the pack, and I said that.
Jill, I'm just conscious of time. We've got about 20 minutes to go. Shall we go ahead with section 3 and then come back to questions at the end?
I think you're going to have to, people who haven't had their question answered, you can just email it to me afterwards and I'll answer them.
We'll do our best to cover some off at the end. But
cool. So part 3, redeployment and endings. So redeployment process, we ask for expressions of interest, because that then lets us know how many people are going to apply for each job. They apply, they have a competitive interview, use an internal application form, because if you use your standard external one, it just annoys people. They will say, I know you know this about me. So just have a simple application form. Start from the top down in the hierarchy, because you need to make sure that in case people who are a manager and don't get a manager job can then go for the officer job. So you start with your most senior jobs first, and then if anybody does want to apply down, they have the opportunity to do that if they don't get a job in the first round of more senior jobs. Make sure it's no shoo-ins. That's a really good idea. Don't let people think there's favouritism going on. Have your fair selection process, and most of us are pretty good at selection processes. Allow applications down, definitely. Maybe allow applications up. Remember, I talked about suitable alternative and alternative employment jobs. My view is you allow anybody to go for anything. The notice period. Now, in the notice period, are you going to have a trial period for those who've got jobs? There is a statutory right to a 4-week trial period. You can make it longer if you want to. And this is an opportunity for either side to decide they don't want that job or it's not working out. So at the end of the trial period, you can say, it's not working out, we're making you redundant, or they can say, I don't think it's working out, make me redundant. The start date of the new job. So when is this start date going to be? Obviously after your end date. So the start date could be immediately after the end date, or it could be a little bit later, depending on how long your notice periods are and whether you're going to do transition work for people. It's a complicated thing to work out, which I can't give you a hard and fast rule about this one. You can pay in lieu of notice, or if you can afford it, or let them work out their notice. Even if it goes over into the start date of the new regime, you could still have people ending their previous working role, working it out, doing something or other. The implications for those on furlough is that they will not pay pile-on, so they will not pay in lieu of notice. So if you have employees on furlough, you might want them to work out their notice period, because then you will be able to claim that back. Look again at your end date, start date, and as I say, take into account all of these things to work out when you're going to say, we're now in the start of the new. And look at individual ending plans, because everybody's going to have a different idea about what they want to do. And you just have to have a view about whether you can afford pay in lieu of notice or not. I think generally that would be the best thing. More emotions are cropping up now for those leaving and those staying. So those leaving are mourning and not really working for you anymore, which is why sometimes pay in lieu of notice can be an advantage, because people can stay and just be miserable and not, well, as expected, they would be miserable, wouldn't they? But it can have a negative effect on other staff. But if you can't afford pay in lieu of notice, then they've got to stay and do something. They have time off to look for other work. Those staying will often be grieving for their lost colleagues and anxious about, am I going to have to go through this? Can I do the workload that now, extra workload we've all got? So we need to go into a period of reassurance and working out our transition ways of working. Are they going to work? How do we listen to staff in these new jobs? Making sure any trial periods are fair and monitored, so that you know the answer at the end, a bit like a probationary period. You know the answer at the end of the trial period. Am I going to want to keep this person in this job? Look at any support for people. So can you give CV writing or interview practice support? Do you have any other support you might be able to offer, like an employee assistance program? What else could you do for them? And look at the transition period from the old structure to the new structure. What jobs can I give out? What can people do? So in terms of technical endings, pay in lieu of notice, you might want to do that. Pay in lieu of holidays accrued but not taken. Or you can say that people always have the right to their holidays. Again, furlough will not pay that if you're paying in lieu of holidays, but they will pay holidays if they take them in the notice period. You can actually say to staff, I want you to take your holidays in the notice period, provided you give them twice as long as the holiday they want to take. So if they want to take 2 days holiday, you give them 4 days notice. And then look at any statutory redundancy pay they're entitled to, or your own contractual redundancy pay if you've got any. Time off to look for other work is described as reasonable in law. That's as long as a piece of string, really. So you just have to work out what you're thinking is reasonable and apply it consistently. Think about any other support and training and the employee assistance program. And the only other bit to say about endings is you allow an appeal process. So people who are losing their jobs are dismissed in law, and it is always wise to offer an appeal. And the other good reason to do that is in law, technically, it's a bit of a technical thing here, you can what's called remedy procedural failings in an appeal process. So if you've got any of the above wrong, or they say you've got it wrong, then you can go over it again. You can give them opportunities perhaps, or you can remedy some stuff in the appeal process. And that's a fairly technical little thing, and it shouldn't be necessary because you'll have done a good redundancy fair process anyway. That's one for people to ask me questions about after. So that was whizzing through. Helen, what are the key points?
So there's a couple of things here. Got one question around, if one unique role is ceased, their work no longer exists, is it the same process with a staff meeting?
If you're just making one person at risk of redundancy,
yeah.
Well, I would still do a staff announcement, even if it's only a staff meeting, so that other people understand what's going on. You don't have to, but I would always let other people know what's going on, because otherwise they'll hear it from the one at risk. It's better for you to control the messaging. And the other thing you might want to do on launch day is give out messaging to other key partners and funders, perhaps. Just a thought.
Yeah. And we've got another one on staff meeting. So what is the best reason for a staff meeting on launch day? I.e., what do we tell staff as to why we need to meet them all without causing anxiety?
Just say it's a compulsory staff meeting for organisational planning, I don't know, something like that. Don't use the redundancy word. Just say that we need to talk to everybody about our plans.
Yeah. And in those
basically, there's no way of not giving them a bit of a clue, because we need people to come, but you just don't use the word redundancy.
And another question around that staff announcement is, in the staff announcements, we don't share the names of who is at risk. So the question
you share the posts. Yeah. Posts, not people. Yeah, because that's part of your business case, which everybody can see. So as part of the business case, you have to say which posts are at risk. So you use the job titles. You don't say Sheila and Frederica are at risk. You say the finance coordinator and the advice worker post is at risk.
We've just got one final bit here, which is a bit more of a comment. So I'm going to try and phrase it into a question for you, but it's a question around when you're running on reserves, and if we didn't go for redundancies, there was a chance of the charity closing down. So when you need to make a decision very quickly, is there any advice on what you might do in that situation?
A redundancy is a legal process which you have to do. You can't short circuit it, I'm afraid. You could make your consultation 1 week. You could make your proposal one side of A4, but you still have to go through it, because otherwise it's unfair dismissal potentially. So you can make decisions very quickly, but I would say make sure you've got your cash flows on speed dial, you know, on your computer screen every day, and plan ahead, because I think the shortest you can do a good redundancy, fair redundancy process is 6 weeks, probably a month if you're really pushing it. If there's any redeployment jobs, if there are no redeployment jobs, maybe 2 weeks, but I mean, that really is pushing it. I would hate to do that.
Thanks, Jill. And just another question that's just come through. I think it's a bit of an example. For the staff at risk, when we conduct the 10-minute telephone interview, for example, on a Monday, do we tell staff beforehand that we will ring them?
Yeah, so as late as possible on the Friday, or maybe even the Monday morning, because if they're furloughed, they should be, or if they're workers, they should be working, they should be available. Maybe the furloughed people you need to give a bit more notice to. So just give them a say, I'd like a 10-minute conversation with you on Monday morning. Here's your slot. Yes, it will worry people, but by the time we get to that point, you know, that we've got to give them a little bit, there is an inevitable little bit of anxiety going on. You just make it as short as possible. And as part of that heads up meeting, you say to them, you need to go and book your individual consultation meeting now, and have that, a process for doing that clear. So then they get to hear it, the whole detail in much more, you know, an hour's meeting. Individual consultation meetings should be half an hour to an hour. So you go over the whole thing in much more detail with those individuals at risk.
Great, thanks, Jill. I think that's all the questions for now. Does anybody else have any other questions that they wanted to ask? Obviously, if it's a very specific scenario, you'll be able to get in touch with Jill afterwards, but any kind of generic questions, please feel free to pop those through now. We've got a few minutes left.
Okay, I'm going to just start my closing spiel, and then I'll come back to any questions if necessary. So there is additional paperwork for you to have if you want it. So please do this by email. On the bottom of your handout that you got is my email, jill@jilltaylor.org.uk. Email me if you would like the paperwork. So there's the at-risk letter, the confirmation of redundancy letter template, a more detailed timeline for planning what you do when, the scripts, the 3 scripts for the 3 things. So you can have all of those from me. The other thing is, if you are a Lloyds grantee, you can have 2 hours free with me. Again, email me, let me know you're a grantee, and we'll book in the 2 hours if you need it, whenever you need it. It can be from, I don't work on Fridays, so from next week, anytime. If you're not a Lloyds grantee, you can still email me simple questions. If it turns into something more complicated, we might need to discuss fees, but I'm very happy to answer straightforward questions from anybody on this webinar. And thank you for coming. I know it's a horrible thing you're going to be going through, so the more support I can give you, the better. I'm very happy to do that. That's it for me.
Thanks, Jill. There was just one question on what is statutory redundancy, which I think you covered at the start, and I know we had a few people who joined a little bit late, so it might be that those people might be better to contact you unless you can do a quick response to that, which I'm guessing might be
okay. Statutory redundancy pay, if that's what we're talking about. Statutory redundancy is you get rights. I'm just going to see if I can go to a slide. Can I go to a slide? There we are, statutory redundancy rights. So for any length of service to be considered for redeployment, to notice, contractual or statutory, whichever is greater, to reasonable time off to seek other work, and if 2 years length of service at the end date or more, a statutory redundancy payment. Now that is based on your age, your length of service, and your pay. So it's £538 a week at the moment is the cap for statutory redundancy pay. If you earn less than that, the calculation is based on your actual pay. And you can find a ready reckoner on the government website where you can fill in all of these details and it will give you an answer. Cool, that's that, I think.
Great. Well, it doesn't look like we've had any more questions come through, and we're 3 minutes to go. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. A really difficult topic in a really difficult time. So if some of you are having to look ahead to making redundancies, we'll be thinking of you in that process. And of course, you can reach out to Gill, as she's just explained, for more help and advice. And I'll be sharing information with anyone registered today about some of the stuff Gill covered at the end there. A huge thank you to Gill as well for the session today. It's, thank you as well for postponing and coming back for those of you who came to the delayed session, but it's been really, really beneficial for everyone, hopefully. Just before you head off, it'd be really helpful if you could fill in a quick feedback poll for us. It's just a few short questions. We're still learning a lot about how to deliver these sessions online, so your feedback is always really valued. I'll pop that poll up for you now, and feel free to drop off the call as soon as you've completed that, and I'll be following up with an email in the next day or so.
Good.
Watch that. There you go. So there's that final feedback poll for you. So thanks ever so much, everybody. Once you've completed that, just feel free to drop off the call.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.